Hello and welcome. Today's video will be about repairing the cargo deployment feature of your Starmax bomber. In these three mechanisms I have to repair, I'm going to show you three different ways of repairing, two keeping the same gearbox, and one is just I'm going to go ahead and swap it out with a new one and show you how to best install it. And I've got it down to such a way where you don't have to really modify the mechanism that originally came with the toy, but you do have to modify the new motor, which I think is better than modifying the original toy, just in case you want to repair the motor and swap it out with an original version later. For this mechanism I have here that I just took off the guide, it has washers in it, which is something new. I've never seen that before. So let's go ahead and disassemble this part. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the outside driver gear for this assembly. That way I can take out the axle. Remove these two screws. And then that way I can better look at this axle with S-spring and and gear. And you know, I've only found one that the S-spring gear was broken. You know, and there's no real way to replace that, so I just went ahead and I glued that S-spring gear. I put some glue where the crack was, and I just went ahead and I turned the axle and smeared it all over the inside there, and it turned out fine, no problem. So I'm gonna go ahead, okay, and let's get on to the next one. Now, as I'm opening up these assemblies, diagnosing each gearbox. That last gearbox, of course, the S-spring gear is bad. So I'm taking out the guide to the next assembly, taking it off the rack. Everything looks good. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this outside driver gear to this assembly. Open her up and inspect the gearbox. And also that large gear and S-spring gear. And that looks fine. Like I said, I've only run into one so far that didn't work. That S-spring gear was broken. But yeah, this seems to work fine. Okay. Go ahead and move on to the motor. Oh yeah, this one's bad too. Okay, let's move on to this last assembly. Remove the guide. Now, in the first video I did with these Starcom toys, I went ahead and I disassembled the whole toy for you all, but I think this is a little bit simpler. That way you don't have to go through the whole disassembly of the toy. Many of you know how to disassemble it and reassemble it. It's just this portion of the cargo deployment feature that needs to be fixed on the majority of the toys. So looking at that, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the outside driver gear. Remove the axle and inspect it. Looks good. Okay, very good. Yep, and a bad S-spring gear. I shouldn't be able to move the axle in and out of the gearbox like that. So we'll start off with this one. going to go ahead and remove this main driver gear from the outside of the gearbox. And then with my X-Acto knife, I'm going to go ahead and use the cutting edge to get into the seam and take the spring housing cover off of the gearbox. The spring doesn't look all that great, so I think I'm not going to use it. I'll go ahead and extract the axle. I'm going to go ahead and get myself 2 gearboxes out of the toys that hop, since I'm just going to go ahead and harvest either the S-spring gear and main gear with axle from it, so I can use them to repair the original gearbox for the Starmax bomber. And yeah, this S-spring gear is in really bad shape, so we can't use that. I can reuse that main gear. I'll set that S-spring gear up there in the corner along with this spring. I'm not going to use that. And I might use the axle, I'm not sure. I think what I'm going to do is, for this gearbox, I'm just going to go ahead and extract the S-spring gear and main gear with the main axle out of this new gearbox and install it into the original one for this assembly. And that'll be the first way that I will show you how to fix your gearbox. So now that I've extracted what I needed, I'm going to go ahead and throw the rest of it away and save the main axle with S-spring gear and main gear, and go ahead and install it into the original gearbox that came with the toy. Now I'm going to go ahead and put in gear 2. Next will be gear 1, or the spur gear. Then I'll put in gear 3. And now I'll put in the C gear, or caging gear. After that, I'm going to go ahead and put in the housing divider. That went well. Did a little test there, seems good. And now I'm going to go ahead and put in this new spring. Now we have to make sure when you put in the new spring to make sure it fits in between both ears and the axle of the S-spring gear. And the other end of it, go ahead and fit it through these little 2 protrusions or forks at the edge of the housing divider, leaving the spring hanging outside of the gearbox. Now I've replaced the spring housing cover, and I'm going to wind it up. When you wind it up, make sure you turn it in the direction that the spring is coming out from, and you'll never get it wrong. And there we go. Now we have a fully functioning gearbox. I'm going to make an adjustment to the spring here so it lies flush along the side of the housing to this gearbox. Wind it up and let it go. Nice. All we have to do now is cut down the axle to meet the size requirement so it fits inside the assembly of this rack and pinion. I'm going to go ahead and file it down a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and rough up the axle on the outside using this file. That way we can glue that driver gear to the axle. I'm going to go ahead and get my glue, get it ready. Now, after I put a little bead of glue on the axle, with a twisting motion, I slowly work my way down the axle to leave a little bit, like a micron or two of gap in between that driver gear and the housing to the gearbox. And then after twisting it for a little bit, the glue tends to set and give you a little bit of friction while you're turning it, and that's when I stop and I leave it and I let it dry. Now I'm going to go ahead and work on this next gearbox. As before, I'm going to go ahead and take my X-Acto knife and split apart the seam, removing the housing spring cover. And I think what I'm going to do for this gearbox is I'm going to keep the original axle and just simply remove the S-spring gear and main gear from it and replace them. Doing this, I don't have to use glue in order to mount the outside driver gear to the gearbox. Everything will be held in by friction, including the S-spring gear. So watch closely. Okay, now that I've removed all the gears, I'm going to take that main gear and save it for another day. And this S-spring gear is beyond repair. It just slips on the axle. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and take another one of these gearboxes from the Toys That Hop. And just recently, just on a side note, I went over to Hobby Lobby the other day and I found these gearboxes from the Toys That Hop in a baggie. I think it's an assortment of 6 and you get them for $4.99, which is nice. So Hobby Lobby, I think I'll do a video about that, or maybe like a short about finding them at Hobby Lobby. That was kind of cool. So these are my Hobby Lobby gearboxes that I'm extracting the spring and S-spring gear and main gear from. These were not bought on Amazon. So tossing all that aside, the housing I don't need, and these little gears, I can save them for another day. Now I'm going to go ahead and hammer out this S-spring gear from this axle, since we won't be using the axle for the repair of this gearbox. And this gearbox that's been repaired is the glue has dried and it's functioning great. It's ready to go. Nice. Okay. So getting back to this S-spring here, I'm going to have to hammer it out to extract the S-spring. And it seems like the main gear fits well over that, so we'll put the main gear in since it rotates fine around it. Now we'll pressure fit the S-spring gear onto the axle. Since the axle that I just unmounted it from is a micron smaller than the original axle from the toy, you can go ahead and just pressure fit it onto it. It takes a little bit of work and a little bit of skill, but if you want to keep your original axle so you don't have to glue the driver axle to it, this is your best option. Now I'm going to take my tweezers and grab onto the outer edge of that S-spring gear and push it down. And there you go. Nice. Make sure you didn't push it too far down, or else you'll give the gearbox a little bit too much friction there. And notice I had already installed gear 2 underneath it. That way I don't have to lift up that main gear to push in gear 2 later. That's a big step there. You should have that in there before you pressure fit that S-spring gear onto the main gear. Replacing the gears now. 1, 3, and then this C gear. Go ahead and replace the housing divider. Nice. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the original spring from this gearbox. That way it's mostly all original, except of course again for the S-spring gear and main gear. And as before, make sure you fit the spring in between the ears, wrapping it around the axle and fitting it in between the ears, and let the rest of the spring go out onto those little forks on the outer edge of the housing spring cover, and then winding it up in the direction that the spring is coming out of the gearbox. And there we go. We have our second finished gearbox that's mostly original. And like I said, you don't have to use glue. You can pressure fit that outer driver gear onto the gearbox and it's good to go. Now we have 2 working gearboxes. Now for this third one, I'm just going to go ahead and swap it out with a new gearbox. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and install the newly refurbished gearboxes into their rack and pinion assemblies. and see how they work. Okay, first cargo assembly is complete, and it works normally. Let's get on to the second one. For this assembly, I've overwound the gearbox, so it's not doing a full cycle. I'm going to have to remove the guide and let the gearbox unwind a little bit, and then replace the guide. Okay, now we have two working rack and pinion cargo deployment mechanisms for our Starmax bombers. Let's move on to the last one, which will be a complete gearbox swap using a new gearbox I'm going to go ahead and select a gearbox associated with the toys that roll, since I have a lot of these gearbox left over. I'm also working on a different technique to be able to keep the space station elevator almost in original condition as well. So that'll be in the next video. But for right now, let's get to swapping out and modifying this new gearbox to fit in our Starmax bomber cargo deployment assembly. Wow, that's a lot to say. So first, I'm going to go ahead and cut off these wheels that are connected to gear 3 in this gearbox. I'm going to go ahead and start shaving down these axles and removing these unnecessary bits off of the gearbox to better modify it. I'm going to go ahead and push in the axle, or push out the axle for gear 3. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut it, shorten it up. And file it down a little bit. Now I'm comparing the main axle from the original gearbox to the new one. That way I can cut it appropriately to the length needed to fit inside the assembly. Now I'll file down smooth out that axle, and now I'm going to rough it up so I can glue the driver gear to the main axle. I'm going to take my screwdriver and remove the driver gear from the original box, and the axles look the same length, which is nice. And that's how it's going to fit inside the assembly. Now, like I've said before, this gearbox is a little bigger than the original. So what I'm going to do after I glue the driver gear onto that axle is I'm going to start shaving down the outside housing of the new gearbox. And this gearbox, I'm going to go ahead and save it for a different toy. I can use it for, like, example, for the Harv 7, which only take those dimension size gearboxes in the first place. So in the idea of keeping the Harv 7 in the original state that it needs to be in order to function correctly, keeping that gearbox would be your best bet for a different project. All in all, anything that I can salvage from these toys and reuse either in a different way or in the same way that it was intended is a bonus. Okay, so now that we've let this gearbox set for a little bit, let's go ahead and, oh, something's wrong here. I might have used a little bit too much glue, and this is the risk you take when you use glue to mount this external driver gear. So hopefully it didn't mess anything up, and I'll be able to loosen it up a little bit. You know, just even the vapors from this super glue kind of gets into everything. So, brother. Hopefully I loosened it up a lot. Okay. All right. It seems like I got it in time. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now let's get to shaving down this gearbox so it fits inside the assembly. Now you can best gauge how it fits the way the main axle is looking on that hole that's in the assembly. If you can see it there, there's a hole there that the main axle, you can see it pretty much center. It fits center in that hole for the original gearbox. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shave one side a little bit, and it's okay if you shave enough that you start seeing inside the gearbox. It's okay because the gearbox is held together anyways. You're just removing bits so it'll fit in there. It's not going to affect the way the gearbox runs in any way. Unless you get little shavings inside, which you don't want. But like I said, see how it fits in the center there? You can adjust the way it fits by shaving away little bits and pieces of the gearbox. I didn't show this in the last video, or rather saying the first video I made concerning this toy, which I should have done, but this video I'm gonna go ahead and clarify how I do that. So the more you shave off, the more you can see where you need to remove bits in order for that axle to be right smack dab in the middle of that hole. And once you can achieve that, then the gearbox is where it needs to be. That way you don't run into any problems when you're trying to fit it in there, and then when you assemble the whole mechanism, it won't give you problems. So I'm going to go ahead and shave a little bit more off. And it seems to be working fine. Nice. Okay. Go ahead and fit it on there. See how it fits. And you see now how it fits flush. I really don't have to shave anything down. And we can go ahead and put it together. So in this way, I'm only modifying the gearbox itself. And I'm not modifying the toy like I did in the very first video I did ever since this whole thing started with the repairing the Starcom toys. That way it stays in original condition. And like I said, in the endeavor later on, you find yourself a gearbox, an original gearbox that you can replace with this modified new one to keep the toy in original condition, you can. And you know, this is a lot better than shaving off pieces of the original toy. And this toy has washers on that guide, so this one's going to be a little tricky to put that in there. That way the washers don't fall out. So I'm going to have to do it upside down. So for this assembly again, I have overwound the gearbox, and I'm going to have to remove the guide and let the gearbox unwind. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and finish cleaning up this assembly. And then we will have 3 fully functional cargo deployment assemblies for the Starmax bombers to be installed into. And wow, I'm excited. This is nice. So there you have it. 3 ways of repairing the cargo deployment feature of your Starmax bomber. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching. See you on the next video.